Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome all of you again to a really wonderful next session of the APDR National Virtual Noon Conference Series. My name is Dr. Hart Beatty. I'm the chair of the APDR Education Committee and Neuroradiology Fellowship Director at Boston Medical Center. It is really my pleasure today to have two real thought leaders in the field of radiology. We're exploring the non-clinical space today with radiology education and leadership. As we do every week, I just want to go through a few housekeeping items with you before I introduce today's speakers. As you all know, the webinar is being recorded and it will be hosted on the APDR YouTube channel. Give about a week's turnaround for that. In saying that, the webinar and questions and answers and comments are also being recorded. All attendees are muted as they enter the meeting just to ensure optimal quality for the participants. And if you do have questions for our presenters today, please use the Q&A tool through the Zoom platform, and we'll try to get to those during the session. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce both of our speakers today, Dr. Kurt Schoppe, really a thought leader in our space, and both these guys are contributors to our field. Dr. Schoppe is going to be talking about how physicians are paid and why that matters, including tales from the front lines. And again, a pleasure to introduce Dr. Frank Lexa, who'll be speaking afterwards, giving a topic on getting started in leadership, how to lead when you're not in charge. So without further ado, I'd like to start this great session, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'll ask Dr. Schoppe to take over the screen share and start his presentation.
I appreciate it. Thanks, Harp. Thanks for the opportunity to talk with you guys today. We're going to talk about how physicians and hospitals are paid, why it matters for you, and what it means for the future. We'll be going through some reasonably dense material. Unfortunately, I have some conflicting obligations today. But if you list your questions in the box, I will promise you I will get back to each and every question that you have with some reasonable expediency. So with no further ado, we'll get started here. So our goal is talking about how we're paid, and it's complicated and it's evolved over time. It gets even down into the details of how Medicare values physician work. And it can feel needlessly esoteric. But you really shouldn't shy away from these topics because the details are important. Because if we understand payment policy and the processes, our decisions will be better informed. We'll be better equipped to thrive in difficult environments. And I promise you it's going to get difficult, as you've seen recently, and there's no reason to expect that to change. So as an overview, we're going to talk about who pays for what in healthcare, some of the basics of how Medicare pays physicians, recent things Medicare has done, some issues with hospital payments, challenges we face, and why this uncertainty is in some ways necessary. So, who pays? Well, there's a lot of payers. The largest is the federal government, Department of Defense and the VA, really. But it even goes into the Indian Health Services. So when you think about payers, most people usually think about the third-party payers, the so-called BUCA payers. So there's still more layers, and it really depends on what we're paying for. But here's your biggest payers. We're going to lump the government under one and call it Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And if you think of procedures and caring for patients, that's Medicare and BUCA. That's Blue Cross Blue Shield, United, Cigna, and Aetna. And, you know, they pay for patient care to a degree. They pay for the equipment and software. And now, who is paying depends on how we navigate the world of payment policy. So the hospitals and physician practices also pay. So like my group is an independent physician group. We pay for certain services, but so do hospital systems to a degree, and so do corporations, employers. And that's a really important distinction to make. And it depends on the patient's age, the site of service, their employed status, or local policies. Now, how you are paid depends on who is paying. So Medicare pays physicians based on negotiated rates in the Medicare physician fee schedule. Medicare pays hospitals based on two different fee schedules, either the hospital outpatient prospective payment schedule or the inpatient prospective payment schedule. The BUCA players, the insurance players, pay based on negotiated contracts. And then what hospital systems, physician groups, and others pay and how they pay is based on vendor-specific contracts and for the pieces that you use. But there's a big missing piece here, if anybody's picked up on that yet, and that's patients. patients are a big chunk of who pays, and they're paying more and more as time goes by. They may end up paying cash. They pay insurance premiums if they're not covered by their employer, and they pay them either through their paycheck to a degree through their employer or through the health exchange networks. You have deductibles, you have co-pays and co-insurance. And we won't necessarily get into a lot of the details here, but you see that the patient contributes to a lot. But even more than the patient, one of the biggest non-governmental payers for healthcare is employers. So the customer of an insurance company is not a patient. The customer of an insurance company is the employers. Employers pay for healthcare through premiums. They may be self-insured or fully insured, and through secondary insurance markets. So an example of that would be when any employee of my practice, Radiology Associates of North Texas, gets healthcare, our group is responsible for the first $100,000 of that healthcare for anyone. Then after that, we have a secondary or captive insurance that kicks in so that we don't end up going broke. But that's why you see other employers like Lowe's or Home Depot making separate deals with hospital systems to say fly their cardiac patients from anywhere in the country to Cleveland to get their care, because they've negotiated directly with the hospital system, because the employers pay for a lot. The insurance companies, the BUCA players, Blue Cross, United, Cigna, Aetna, they manage claims and they negotiate rates for the employers. The employers are responsible for paying the money, and that's a very important distinction for you to understand. So now we get to a question of how much. And it's not as simple as RVUs. It depends on geography, contract terms, market forces, lots of other things. But we're going to look at one example, and that's price variability, closely related to price transparency. And so it's easy to think that a head CT should be priced the same everywhere. And people have used the analogy that getting an imaging study is like going into a Starbucks. It's the same cup of coffee everywhere, so the price should be about the same. And there is a lot wrong with that idea, and we're going to attack it just here briefly. But this is price variability in a head CT for academic hospitals. And you see a very large range there, from a couple $100s to $2,200. And now everybody likes to make private practice out to be the bad guys, but here's payer variability for private practices, much more concentrated around $500 to $800, but you still have a very broad range there, similar to the academic centers. And this comes down to market forces. So hospitals have a broader range there because they use their market position and their different fee schedules to negotiate different rates or be able to force people into paying different rates. And that comes down especially in the technical charge. Now, is price transparency part of the solution? Well, there's no such thing as a free lunch, and it's a pretty nuanced problem. And I've tried to address this before, but there are unintended consequences for price transparency. You can have the risk of commoditization. It disrupts incentives for shared savings. If everybody has a published price, then you're going to accelerate consolidation and corporatization, because market dominance could lead to raising those prices. And in the absence of quality, many times price serves as a proxy for quality. So paradoxically, you could end up with higher prices with price transparency, because like the reason people buy a lot of Apple products, because of a perceived quality benefit, they're willing to pay more money for that benefit or service, but it, especially in healthcare, is very hard to judge quality. And so price serves as a proxy there. Even so, even with that caveat, you'd likely have continuously decreasing prices. And so it would take away the incentives for investments in quality, service, and most likely lead to a severe decrease in the availability of services, especially in poor rural areas or for complex patients. So let's get back to how much, and we're going to talk about how this gets a little bit dirty. So what is in an RVU? So an RVU is the relative value unit, but there's a lot contained in there. And most people care about the connection between RVUs and money. So we're going to talk about this briefly. So to get to money, you take a relative value unit times what's called the conversion factor. Now that's set by Medicare and Congress on an annual basis. And so yes, it's complicated formula, but this is your work RVU for physicians. There's a technical RVU and then a practice liability RVU, and they're all modified by geographic variables. but it gets down to your payment is your RVU times the conversion factor. So a 1 RVU study in 2018 was worth $35.99. 2019 it was $36.04, and 2020 is $36.09. And it doesn't take a genius to see there that this basically does not keep up with any rate of inflation, and we haven't met inflation in a very long time. In fact, the 1998 conversion factor was $36.68, and taking a conservative inflation adjustment, that $36.68 should be $55.57 now. So what Medicare sees is you have about a 50% decrease relative to inflation in what they've been paying you over the last 20 years or so, and everyone seems to be still making a fair amount of money. But let's get down to where the RVUs come from, and they're contained within the relative value scale update process. So the RVRVS is the resource-based relative value scale, and it's managed by the RUC. That's the Relative Value Scale Update Committee. It's done through the AMA. Now the AMA makes recommendations to Medicare. They don't get to be the final arbiter. And in making those recommendations, people see the RUC and the AMA as a cartel or a cabal, and they collude on prices, and that's really not reality. It's much more like a medical fight club. You have a bunch of physicians sitting around a table arguing over the prices of a procedure from multiple different specialties. And so the best analogy I have for you, it's like being in a Senate confirmation hearing, only nobody's in your party and they all think you took something from them. So our job within the ACR economics team that leads on reimbursement, which I'm a part of, is to advocate for our code values. And we do that with clinical expertise and data. And I'm the advisor to the RUC, but radiology does have a permanent seat on the RUC, currently occupied by Dr. Zeke Silva. And so you see a set of permanent seats on the RUC, and then there's a set of rotating seats through different specialties. Now the RUC process, briefly, is taking CPT codes. You have different specialties indicate that they belong to them. They survey their members. So when we determine the data for our value argument, we're asking radiologists to tell us how long it takes them to do a study, like a chest CT, and then how that chest CT compares in value to others. So then we take that data, we make our arguments to the RUC votes on those, and then forwards those recommendations to Medicare. Medicare is the final arbiter on any RVU assignments. And then the reason to concentrate on Medicare is because most private payers will just use the RVU levels as Medicare has picked them, and then either a multiple or a fraction of those as they negotiate individual contracts with hospitals and groups. There's a lot of details in the RVUs, and it can, like I mentioned earlier, feel a little bit esoteric to get into them, but it's important because if you don't understand the details, then you're losing the decision arbitrage and you don't understand what people expect from you. So there's two big components of an RVU. There's time and intensity. And within time, they divide that up into three categories: the pre-service time, the intra-service time, and the post-service time. So pre-service time is fairly self-explanatory. Services provided up to, but any days before and up to the procedure. This is a lot for surgery, but for radiology, this specifically includes looking at prior exams, reviewing patient history, and choosing and communicating protocols to the technologist. Many people consider some of this a value-added service. It is not. It is contained within the RVU, and everyone is paid for it already. The intra-service time, also fairly self-explanatory. This is the work of the procedure, so the actual interpretation of a chest CT. And for radiology specifically, includes dictating the report. And then post-service time is anything done after. So post-operative care or other work, communicating with the patient or other professionals. Again, if you're making phone calls to ER physicians, to outpatient physicians based on their patient's radiology work, then that's already paid for in all the RVUs for all radiology studies. Now we discussed time. The other component of an RVU is intensity. And that gets into the mushy gray areas of, how hard is it? How difficult judgment, the training it took to do it, what kind of stress or risk is it? And so you see this start to vary with different procedures. Like an emergent cricothyrotomy is one of the highest intensity procedures to do because basically the patient's going to die if you don't do anything. Whereas interpreting an outpatient x-ray of a foot is fairly low stress, low intensity, and thereby low value. So an example recently is we took the CPT codes for mammography and then bundle them with computer-aided detection to create a new family of CPT codes. These CPT codes now are new. They have no value, so they need to go through the RUC process. So they're bundled as CPT. ACR indicates that we want to survey them. They belong to us. We survey our physicians, take that data, present it to the RUC, and then the RUC comes to a conclusion on the RVUs that should be there and makes those recommendations to CMS. And this actually was one of those positive turnouts. We ended up getting increased value for these codes above and beyond just the bundled value from computer-aided detection. And that really hinged on the fact that the mammographers communicate and work directly with their patients, especially on the diagnostic side, because that's a component of the work. Having that conversation with the patients and discussing their options is very much a part of the work of a mammogram. And those things count for these studies. Now, we did a lot of codes in 2018. We did a fair number of codes in 2019, and it continues for 2020 and 2021. So this process doesn't stop. All of these codes are continuously revalued so that relativity is maintained. Same thing with other specialties. Radiology just ends up being particularly busy because we have a lot of codes. I think the entire gastroenterology code family is about 28 codes, whereas radiology has several hundred. Now, we've talked about physician payments here, and we're going to transition and talk a bit about hospitals. And this is where our academic brethren really need to pay attention because this matters very much for them. It's very tempting to think that people are shielded to a degree from reimbursement policy issues if they're not in private practice and they're in hospitals, and that's just not true. The funding from your department comes from the work that you do. And so hospitals are paid a little bit different than physicians. They're paid on what's called the hospital outpatient prospective payment system. It's very technical, highly arcane, and for clarity, say when a radiology group does work for a hospital, the physicians bill on the Medicare physician fee schedule, the RVU base that we just discussed. HOPS is how hospitals get paid for their technical reimbursement, for owning the machines and the techs and the supplies. Now, very few people really understand HOPS, but it is important, and that's why we're going to go through it a bit. And it's really best to compare it to something that everybody is familiar with to a degree, and that's the EULA, like the End User Software License Agreement. Now, everybody's seen these blocks of text that they just scroll through and click accept or okay, but this text covers the details of your relationship and responsibilities to each other. And so these details have consequences, just like in HOPS. So the way hospitals get paid is they report their costs to Medicare. Those costs are averaged across all the facilities in the country for a specific procedure to get to a geometric mean. Then based on those geometric means, procedures are bundled into big groups called APCs, ambulatory payment classifications. And then hospitals are billed or reimbursed based on those APCs. So a hospital doesn't report that they did an abscess drainage to Medicare. They report that they did APC 305, which contains abscess drainage and many other relatively direct, simple percutaneous procedures. So they're all bundled together and paid one rate. Now, there's a lot of rules that go into how those rates are decided and how those fit in, and we're not going to go into them because they're painfully and tortuously boring, and you don't really read the EULA before you click through. Maybe a few of you do, but most people don't. And so we're not going to go through it because it's either going to put you to sleep or drive you to drink. And I'll give you an example. Cost is a CMS-defined concept. It's not the actual cost to hospitals of what those procedures are. Just chew on that a bit. So welcome to payment policy, where logic and common sense are on permanent vacation with their friend fairness. So the reasons HOPS is important, and we're going to talk about three basic issues. HOPS and the hospital payment schedule and the physician payment schedules are merging. And this came about because of the Deficit Reduction Act, where Medicare said they would pay the lower technical rate of either HOPS or Medicare. Well, when that was first enacted, those two fee schedules were so far apart, nobody thought that would happen. But now, because HOPS rates have decreased so much, they are now affecting the rates that physicians are paid for some other procedures not done in a hospital. So this is how you end up getting paid less for a procedure done in an imaging center on a non-Medicare patient, even when it is not done in the hospital system. And so there are codes currently capped at the outpatient rates, And there are a fair number of codes that are at risk of decreasing. And right now, this costs radiology about $13 to $20 million a quarter. But with a few more changes, you see some fairly heavy duty procedures in here. This could end up being hundreds of millions of dollars a year. Medicare is working on site neutral payments, and you have to respect their logic. Why would they feel like they should pay differently for a chest CT depending on if it was done at a hospital or in a doctor's office or at an imaging center? And they do this a few ways right now. They do it through their site neutral policy, in which any new centers don't, even if they're owned by a hospital, are paid based on the physician schedule, or from the Deficit Reduction Act, paying the lower of HOPS or the Medicare physician schedule. And you're seeing cuts of 25 to 50% here with just a snap of the fingers. This affects technical reimbursement and affects capital. So this affects your academic radiology departments to the effect that they need money for planning, staff compensation, recruiting, and staffing. And these cuts affect them just as much, if not more, than they affect private practices who don't have the same exposure to the hospital systems. And then finally, you're dealing with it's maybe slightly unfair to just put Anthem in here, but you're dealing with third-party payers, the BUCA group. Their job is to save money for their clients. Their clients are not patients, their clients are employers. And so they start enacting policies that will steer people away from hospitals to where these insurance companies have more leverage to pay lower rates. So they're not going to pay for procedures that can be done in a hospital when those procedures could be done in an imaging center or in a doctor's office. Similarly, United has started unilaterally black box changing E&M service codes to lower payment rates based on what they think is the right rate, despite what the physicians document. So while HOPS, everybody loves to ignore it, you clearly see it has a role in how people are getting paid. And so this is a small plug for everybody thinks that they have no impact on how physicians are paid and all of this is handled by the government and they don't care. And that's just not true. It is a collective action problem, but if you can point out disparities to your hospitals, then they can actually report their costs correctly. And it seems like you should trust your hospital finance departments to do this correctly. Only 48% of hospital radiology departments correctly report their costs for MR or CT. That's a tough statistic to live with, and that's why taking some responsibility for it, I think the physicians need to own, which is why I'm trying to convince you that it's a good idea. So we know that physician and hospital payments are in flux, and it's easy to just say we can't see the future. There's lots of excuses. We know we have some wins, like we saw with mammography, like we've seen recently with chest CT and lung cancer screening CT. And I caution against seeing everything else as a constant trend downward, especially relative to inflation. Yes, we will likely have some small cuts and they're going to happen intermittently. Our job is to try to make those cuts happen as slow as possible so we can adjust, adapt, and overcome. And so, yes, we care a lot about professional reimbursement, and technical reimbursements matter too, even if you don't own technical, because those hospitals and corporations are funded by technical fees. So now as a physician, it's easy to feel like it's coming at you from all sides. So you have serious challenges for both professional and technical reimbursement. And so let's look at these. And this is really how we draw a line straight from payment policy to how it affects us individually. Like I mentioned, the convergence of HOPS and the Medicare physician fee schedule lower payments. And because of strong downward trends in the hospital payments, that threatens physician payments, even if those physicians have nothing to do with the hospital. Site neutral payments. Again, you have to respect their logic. Does it make sense to pay differently depending on where a procedure is performed? CMS doesn't think so, Medicare, and patients don't think so. This affects academic departments and corporations in private practice. And you have to ask, what decrease in payment can you afford? Can you afford to decrease payment 5 to 10%? That affects your ability to hire staff, pay staff, buy equipment, software, everything else that you do. That money, where do you think the money comes from to pay for you to go to conferences? It comes from these technical reimbursements. Third-party payers are steering away from hospitals to cheaper outpatient-based imaging. They're steering away from places that they don't have negotiating leverage to places that they do have negotiating leverage. And that's the name of the game. they'll call it market forces, they'll call it value-based care for patients, but they're really working on saving money for their clients. Their clients are employers, not patients. And this is really just the start. The question is it an opportunity? That's something worth exploring. This gets a little more esoteric, but Medicare is starting to pay attention to very, very granular details in how they pay for people. And they, like anybody else, have limited resources, and they want to pay as little as possible to get the most service as possible. So they employ third-party contractors like Strategy Gen, who will use black box techniques to try to figure out how much people should be paying for some of these procedures. And this initially led to a proposed 40% cut in the reimbursement for an ultrasound exam. Luckily, we beat that back, but that's the kind of headwinds we're facing. And they're now pursuing different technical charges with radiology staff times. So one of the most important ways that imaging centers and hospitals are paid is based on the time techs take to do the work, and same with the radiologist. And that's their new line of attack. And finally, the evaluation and management code changes. So we bill CPT codes for procedures. When a surgeon or an internist or family practice physician sees a patient in the office, they bill an evaluation and management code. And for a long time, they felt those codes were undervalued. And so Medicare undertook a project to revalue those codes. Well, the entire Medicare budget is a zero-sum game. So it has to be budget neutral. So if you shift RVUs to one group away from another, that's going to change the conversion factor. And what you're looking at now with the evaluation management code changes is that that conversion factor can decrease from 5 to 12%. So, and that, you know, one RVU study that previously paid $36 may now only pay $32 or $33. And while that a $4 discount doesn't seem like very much on a single study, I promise you over hundreds of thousands or millions of studies a year, that becomes a really significant budgetary hit for hospitals and groups. So what does it mean for you? That's a fair question. And that's really the challenge of how you draw a line from esoteric payment policy to everybody individual. But we have to recognize that healthcare is a business, and we have to deal with the money, no matter how distasteful that may seem. We all want to take care of patients, but if we don't recognize the incentives of all the partners in the process, then we're going to fail to appreciate how we can best navigate this and preserve our ability to care for our patients. So I'm not here to make predictions, and I don't know the future, but my perspective comes from one of understanding payment policy, government process, and payers. So as that introduction, I'm the ACR RUC advisor. I lead the team that negotiates RVUs with Medicare. I am a payment policy expert on alternative payment models in the Economics Commission. I've been on the ACR Corporatization Task Force, and I'm a board member at a large private practice group that deals with these issues. So while I don't know the future, I'd like to think that I come from an informed perspective. And so let's start talking about why this matters, why reimbursement uncertainty matters. It really comes down to big macroscopic moves. We know that the Affordable Care Act and Obamacare was a big deal, but it didn't affect us that much. Deficit Reduction Act did affect radiology a lot and shifted hundreds of millions of dollars away from the specialty, but this started in 2007. We've seen increasing consolidation in industries, not just radiology practices, academic medical centers, or others, but across both physician management groups and large companies, because everybody wants to move for a size advantage to try to control costs. And so consumers have also gotten into this play as well. So they are now having to shoulder more of the cost burden, so they're pushing back against these costs. And finally, the employers, because the government can't control costs quickly enough, the employers are going to push back. And that's really what we're looking at here, is a lot of change is probably going to come through employers. And so the question is, can individual physician practices survive? You're looking at large players in the consolidation game. The future they see is one of big investments in data and big contracts, but they still fundamentally require RVUs, which is why payment policy matters. Another large consolidative entity of an insurer, a pharmacy benefits manager, and a physician practice manager. So is this the new vertically integrated monster you look at? It's possible, maybe even probable, but I don't necessarily think so, because what people are failing to understand is risk. And this is really what you've seen with COVID. People fail to see the black swan or the downside risks. And despite all evidence to the contrary and people writing about it very frequently, we fail to see the downside risk. And so what those organizations have is a limitation to move nimbly and a fair amount of debt. And if they don't have the ability to move nimbly with healthcare changes and manage their cash flow, then they're at great risk. And that's what you've seen start to surface in the end. So we've gone through the age of the physician, probably goes back to Osler and the rest. We've gone through the age of the physician practice, where it was the dominant entity in healthcare, to what I consider the age of the hospital. I don't know what's next. Could be the age of data. We should prepare for it, but there's many ways to consider data, and it still interacts with our legislation and regulation. And so in discussing reimbursement uncertainty, we've looked at both practically and philosophically, and I prefer to take the long view. And even though the roads may not be well traveled, we may need to reconsider what business we are in. Are we the interpreters of imaging, or are we the managers of data that includes imaging in a holistic approach on patient care? But no matter how you consider that future, it still comes back to fee-for-service. You need to understand fee-for-service payments, how people pay you and why, because it's fundamental to alternative payment models, to bundled payments, to physician-focused payment models. Coding and RVUs of individual services are needed to build the infrastructure for these future transactions. So fee-for-service is necessary for accounting and accountability. So it remains a fundamental part of healthcare finance. And while I know we've taken a whirlwind tour here, please let me know the questions that you have. And at that, I'm going to give control back. You have one of the luminaries in healthcare economics and business management to talk to you now. I appreciate your time and wish you the best of luck.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schoppe, for that amazing presentation. I'd like to transition to Dr. Lexa to share his screen and begin his talk.
Well, thank you again. I want to thank Dr. Beda for the opportunity to be here, and it's an honor to be part of this program and to work with Dr. Schoppe on this. And the focus here is going to be on really how to be a good leader and why it's important to lead even if you don't have a title yet, or even if you don't want a title in the future, just how important leadership is in knowledge organizations like the kind that almost everyone on this call, everyone on this program is going to eventually be in, whether you're in an academic department, a private practice, or some kind of other format. You're going to be in a place where you're using your brain, and it's important in knowledge organizations that we have more than one leader and that we hire people who are smart enough to lead at many levels in the organization. And this is really about how to get started. For those of you who are concerned, this will not be on your board exams. It's way more important than that. We're not going to be talking about the cranial nerves today. But just by way of introduction, very briefly, I'm an academic neuroradiologist, and I've been teaching at several business schools, including the Wharton School. And currently, I've got on here what's most important, which is that we have a leadership institute to try to help with these types of topics. And HARP has been a tremendous contributor to that and to the things that we are doing. I don't have any other disclosures that are relevant for this session. And what we're going to cover in the next 25 minutes or so is to really talk about how we get into fallacies in medical leadership. Notions like, well, the most important thing about being a medical leader is how much you have in grant money. And understand that this is something that you can learn how to do. And I was recently asked to write a paper sort of looking at the nature and nurture issues in leadership. And every time we look at these types of things, most people can learn to be leaders, and particularly people who want to be leaders can learn to be leaders. And that's what we do in the RLI. Understand why good leadership is the secret to everyday challenges, as well as the crisis that we're currently facing. And understand that, for those of you who are planning on 30 to 35-year careers, you will see challenges and crises. Some of them may be, as you just heard, like black swans, things we might not have expected to happen. But many of these are going to be things that will happen, going forward, and it's important that you learn from them and be ready for the next ones, because that's really how we define good leadership or poor leadership. We'll talk about why being a leader isn't just a job title or an identifier. you have to build a team and actually lead. It's a verb. And that usually involves building a team of people to get things done, whether it's doing routine things every day, doing things that are particularly challenging, like switching over a PACS system or an information management system, or true crises like the one that we're all living through right now. And we'll talk about how you do this, how you build it, what you need to learn in order to do it. And I promise that I will have this all done by the top of the hour. That's a book that covers some of these topics if you're interested. Now, one of the things we sometimes hear, and I've heard this in many countries, thankfully heard this the first time explicitly in another country, not in the United States where I'm currently living and working now, but this notion that radiologists should just stick to what they do, stay in their dark rooms, and leave the business, leadership, and other grown-up work, and I'm being sarcastic there, but that's how it was said, to others. And I kind of think that that's sort of like what this building is doing. If you live, or if you ever come to the southeast part of Pennsylvania where I live, this is a major agricultural area, lots of interesting things to eat. And in these buildings here, which is right on the border between Pennsylvania and Delaware, they're making mushrooms. And everyone knows the cliche about how you make mushrooms. You keep them in the dark and be polite and say you put manure on them. And that seems to me to be the way that people who say this, that's how they think about us, that we're not smart enough, or we shouldn't be doing this and we should just read the head CTs and be quiet. There's a second school, and I'm obviously more of this viewpoint, that we're elite professionals. We do things that are complicated, they're esoteric, and we should be led by our own. And I strongly believe this. I had a friend who was a year or two behind me in medical school who got to go up on one of the shuttles. And it's like this gentleman here. Every time somebody goes up, there's somebody on the ground who's one of the key leaders, and there are more of them than there were at the beginning. But people who've been there, who've done that, who understand the risks and the difficulties of working up there, who helps lead. And astronauts want to be led by one of their own. Another example, one of my uncles flew these things. I've had several Wharton students who've done that for their careers. And I couldn't imagine them being led by anybody except a man or a woman who's had to do this sort of work. It's complicated, it's incredibly dangerous, it's hard. And you shouldn't be led by somebody whose last job was running HR and at a drugstore or at a automotive factory. It has to be somebody who understands what you do. And I think that's why radiologists should be leading their own. And another question that sometimes comes up, and particularly if you went to business school in a certain vintage year, you might hear the notion that, well, we don't really need leaders anymore. And that's just not the case. But we do hear this sometimes. And if you look at other entities that are like us, I've used the term knowledge worker already, but people who work in IT, who work in IT startups, there's still the need for leadership. It's not just about being the smartest gal or guy in the room. It's really about issues of how we get groups to perform well, how you build group cohesion, how you are building relationships with the hospital or the medical school, not just making a great call on an MRI of the spine. It's also doing these other things. And it's a long list, but these are just some of the things that leaders do. At least effective leaders do these things, and they think strategically, they manage conflict, they do financial planning, they do mentoring, all of those sorts of things. Now, leadership, I put it in ironic quotes there because sometimes for some people, leadership can be pretty easy if you're in a good time where there isn't a lot of change or challenge or stress going on. And so in some places and sometimes it's easier. I don't think it's ever truly easy. I've been taken to task for saying, well, it was easier 20 years ago or it was easier 25 years ago. Every generation has its challenges. That's fair. But certainly in the middle of a crisis, it's safe to say that leadership is hard right now. And it's certainly been inspiring to see radiologists step up and really lead at a much higher level as this crisis unfolded. And the challenges also define you as a leader. In my lectures, I never use specific examples of specific radiologists because I just think that would be very difficult for them. And So for the most part, I don't use specific examples. I tend to pick on US presidents because it kind of comes with the job, and most of them have pretty thick skins, not all of them. But if you look at how we remember those folks, we tend to remember them by the challenges they face, whether it's major depressions, attacks on the United States, other issues, changes in our society. But we remember them for the challenges and how they either met them or they didn't. And just to reiterate, you will see challenges like COVID-19 later in your career. You will see things happen. Challenges are not accidents or aberrations. It's like living in the Bay Area where I used to live. We know there's going to be another earthquake. They haven't had their last earthquake. And in parts of the US that are prone to hurricanes, they haven't seen their last hurricanes. And recessions, we've seen many of these since the US Civil War, and you will see more recessions going forward. So understand that these things do happen again and they do recur. I won't go through this in detail, but this is just mainly to get it out there that there is a curriculum, that there are things that leaders need to know in order to do the things that leaders do. One of the polemics that goes back and forth in the nature and nurture notion is that, well, people are just born this way, like Lady Gaga sang, and that's not the case. There's an element of leadership, or at least the desire for leadership, that does seem to have some genetic and chemical components to it, which is fascinating. But if you actually look at who's an effective leader, it's something that can be taught, and it's certainly a collection of abilities and tasks that can be learned. These are some of the things that you need to know, and these are all things that we cover in the program work that we do at the RLI. We teach people how to negotiate. We teach people how to get the first job and get the right job. We talk about how we fit into the larger society that we live in, and this is true in whatever country you're in right now, how healthcare is regulated by your government and your society. We talk about how you manage your career, and I think many people just, don't focus, many of the people particularly that I meet in healthcare, don't understand that you have to actively manage your career, or you can end up in the wrong job or get stuck. And we talk about issues of service and quality, professionalism. We talk about leadership per se in a much more detailed fashion than I'm doing in this half hour. But we talk about also things like economics and accounting and business planning, strategic planning, and all big challenges. Now, again, to turn back and say, how do you actually lead? This is about leading before somebody hands you the job. And many times people are handed the job of being an alpha leader in a group or department because they do a good job of leading before they get there. And one of the first things you need to do is build a good group of people. And so if you have a challenge that's coming up, an IT challenge, an adaptation to the COVID epidemic, you don't lead by yourself. By definition, leaders lead other people. And sometimes that means building a good working group of people who can adapt to a challenge. A very simple example that I often used before the current epidemic was to talk about just building a way for neuroradiologists to support a stroke center, and how that changes workflow, how that changes our turnaround times and other things like that. And the key thing is to start with a elite group of people and figure it out before you roll it out. And probably all of you at this point in your careers, if you're in radiology or wherever you happen to be, whatever you happen to do, you have by now met some people who are individually very smart, very high functioning, but they're terrible to work with. They actually bring down the performance of a team. And obviously we're talking here about team performance, not individual performance. And we see this in sports, and we certainly see it in medicine and other places. I like to use this example just because this college is just about 4 miles from where I live in Pennsylvania, but there's a nice example of where teamwork really works. This isn't, by any measure, the biggest, most powerful basketball program in the US. They don't send the most people to the NBA, but surprisingly, this smaller school manages to win the national championship every few years because, in part, because they work together as a team. They find individuals who bring out the best in each other, and they're very well coached. And it's a nice example of how, again, being the smartest person in the room doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have the best team. When we lead a group, it's really about what I just said, which is one, first get the right people. Get people who can work together. If you look in any business book that you might pick up, back when we used to walk through airports, we're not walking through any airports this month, but you would see books, business in the popular business press. Almost every one of them would start off with a chapter about how to succeed in business, and it would invariably, early on in the book, there would be a chapter about getting the right people, because it's very hard to lead if you've got the wrong people. If you've got people who are going to fight, who are going to undermine each other, people who are toxic. Now, you can't always get rid of the wrong people. You can't always get the right people. Sometimes you can fix and optimize the people you have. And I've been in all three of those situations at one time or another in the leadership roles that I've had. But it's also about setting norms and expectations. And it's also, and some people hate to hear this, but you have to be a role model. And great leaders are role models. And I was just reading a book about Churchill this week because I have more time to read than I normally do. And amazing example of great leadership under extraordinary stress at the beginning of the Second World War. And part of it was being a role model and taking risks himself, and so that people would be rallied and would follow and do the right things in a tough situation. You have to be a role model. Next, you have to actually pick the right things to do, because again, leadership is not something that's done in a vacuum. And when you talk about getting started in leadership, and we'll walk through an algorithm in a moment to talk about how you do that, you have to do things where you're actually changing something for the better. And the first project that I ever did as a very young neuroradiologist was to take a hard look at how we were doing carotid endarterectomies at the University of Pennsylvania. And the team we put together was a multi-departmental team. We had everybody in there. We had the surgeons, the radiologists, we had the nursing staff, the ICU staff, anesthesia, all working together. But the focus was something that would increase value for our patients and streamline what was at the time a relatively cumbersome and highly variable part of how we did work at the hospital. Projects like that can be internal, but sometimes you'll get external pressures where the stakeholders outside radiology or even outside your hospital, and these can be institution-wide, but they tend to come in two flavors like that. When we think about where to find value, this is a value chain for radiology services, and I think those of you who are paying close attention to the slide will probably notice what's not on there, which is it's not about, I left film reading off, because I know that people who are radiologists like myself, we care deeply about being great at reading films, and most of us are very good at it. But in fact, there are other ways we provide value, and these are just some other places where if you're looking to get started in leadership, these are places to look. And I bet everybody on the call, particularly those of you who are young, particularly those of you who are taking overnight call, anybody who's working in a difficult situation or challenging area like being in a trauma center, being in a stroke center, I bet you could make a huge list of things that could be better. If you are in a place where nothing needs to be better, please give me a call, because I would love to come and work with you. Most of these places need a lot of help, and being at the tip of the spear, you can help. And this is just a list of ways to start thinking about it and get started. And then finally, if you have the right people, if you found the right target, then how do you actually do this? If you need to improve report turnaround time, if you need to improve how patients are coming through an MR center, if you have to do, come up with some other way to conserve PPE, whatever challenge you're facing, whatever thing you need to do, how do you actually do that? And all of us have different ways that we approach problems. But once you've got the right team, once you understand the issues, here's one way to do it. It's not the only way to do it, but when someone says, well, how do you actually do it, Frank? Sometimes when I'm stuck, sometimes I'm doing this more like jazz, where I'm just doing it and it's working. I'm not thinking a lot about how I do it. But if I get stuck or if someone asks me how to do it the first time, this isn't a bad way to do it. And so this is an algorithm. For those of you who like algorithms and approaches, it's a nice little book. Roger Fisher was a brilliant man, actually negotiated one of the first treaties between the United States and the Soviet Union that genuinely reduced the risk that these two countries would annihilate each other with nuclear weapons. So he was a very good negotiator, very smart person. Little book, just how to do it, and just 5 steps, and starting with a purpose, then thinking about it, then learning as you do this, how to build engagement and how to do feedback. And I'll walk through this very quickly. But first, you have to have a clear aim. And this has to be what is called SMART. This is a cliche that's used in the business world, but it's one of the cliches that's actually very useful, because I will sit in meetings, some days, I can be stuck in meetings for over half of my workday and listen to people talking about things that don't meet any of these 5 criteria. They're not specific, they're not measurable, they're not attainable, they're not realistic, and they're not timely. Well, then, we're having an interesting discussion, but we're not going to be able to move forward. If you can meet all of these, that's fantastic. If you can meet most of them, you will succeed. You want to think about what the goals are. What are we trying to do here? Are we trying to treat more patients? Are we trying to not burn out our staff? Are we trying to get by until somebody builds more PPE for us? What are we trying to do? But think about the goals. And again, it sounds ironic or nasty, but be a good radiology department. It's not a terrible goal, but it's not a project goal. It's not specific enough. It's not measurable, attainable, realistic, or timely. That's not good either. That's a little bit better. And this is pretty good because we can figure this out, and we can, it pretty much meets what we have above. So this is how you do it. Next step is you think. And you don't just say, well, let's make the radiologists work harder so that'll make report turnaround time improve. Sometimes you stand there and you think, and that's not a misprint. And when we were trying to build the first stroke center project that I did, we realized that most of the issues were related to communications and transport. And it wasn't that the neuroradiologists were lazy. It was that we weren't figuring out ways to fast track the people who needed to be fast tracked. And you think about who will help you do this. When it came to communication and transport, we needed other people, because we're not going to really start sending the neurofellows downstairs to move the patients around. Think about how you're going to build a team, how you're going to quantify results, how you're going to implement the project. First time we did a stroke center, it was interesting. The stroke patients, once they were identified, got fast-tracked. Not surprisingly, the incidence of stroke in Philadelphia skyrocketed because more people wanted to get their patients done faster. And they said, well, it might just be that the patient's drunk, but they could be having a stroke too. And you can imagine how that went. So you want to watch your results and look for untoward consequences, unexpected results. And then make sure you've got what you need. Do you have the right software? Do you have the right people? Those sorts of things. And you learn. And once you start to implement change, pay close attention. Figure out what's going on. Again, are you having unexpected results? And is the ED changing things? Are other people helping you or hurting you? This is how you learn. And again, this is just a good paradigm or algorithm for how to approach these kinds of things. Again, you have to have a team. You have to be able to engage. For most of us in radiology, for the next decade or two, it's going to be hard to do great research in a silo. And a lot of the research that society wants from us and institutions wants from us means breaking out of the silo and working with other entities. In my case, it's working with neurologists, neurosurgeons, and increasingly even people who are a little bit further afield. But that's where we're getting a lot of the interesting population health work, that kind of stuff going. So you have to be able to put a team together. One of the things that I learn every time I do this is I learn who's good on a team and who isn't, who I can trust, who I can't. And the more you do this, the better you'll get at it. And leadership, in your leadership role, you'll do this more than once. So it's very helpful to figure that out. Once you've completed a project, you take time to analyze it. So if you can take a big breath once this surge is over, and you're starting to think, well, what happens if this thing comes back next winter in the middle of flu season, or better yet, it goes away, but understanding that sooner or later, something like this will happen again. Hopefully not for a while, but be ready for that. If you analyze the process, if you look at how well you did, look at the people you had, figure out what you did right, what you did wrong, you'll be much better positioned for when you have to lead again. And also use 360-degree feedback. You know, being a leader, you have to have a bit of a thick skin. And if nothing else, if you really get good feedback, you'll be better the next time. And all of us are imperfect as leaders, and the best leaders are ones who at least understand their imperfections and work on them, as opposed to the narcissistic people who think they're perfect and aren't smart enough to work on their issues. Now, if you want to succeed as a leader, anything, small projects, big projects, crises, things you just have to do. First, you got to manage yourself. You got to keep yourself under control. If you're panicking, you're not going to be very inspiring as a leader. You got to stay focused. How to build a great team. You have a plan, but understand that you use it and improve it. One of the US presidents who was probably the best planner we ever had in the White House was the same person who led the US military during World War II, and at least led the invasion at Normandy by the Allies. You know, was Dwight Eisenhower, and he used to say the planning's everything, but in the end, plans are nothing. And his point was that, and paraphrase that slightly, but his point was that the process of building a plan is what matters, because then you are ready when the weather changes or something else changes. It's not that you follow the plan to the letter, but you've prepared enough, then you're resilient enough that you can handle, you know, the chaos that is warfare, and you can be resilient and win anyway. So having a plan, it's really the process that matters, not the plan. You have to understand that in leadership, it's not black and white. There's lots of gray. People do lose small battles, but what matters is winning overall. And you know, you plan to lead and you need to learn to lead, and we can help you with that in the RLI. And some best practices as we close. I like to start small, show that this works in our small, easy hospital before we put it in the big, complicated one. And most of us are in complicated systems where we have more than one site, we have more than one service. Make sure it works and have a plan. Again, the plan itself isn't, you know, the goal. It's the planning and, you know, figuring it out, adjusting it. Find the right people, fix the people you can, use their skills. If people really are problematic and toxic, try to get them onto somebody else's project and keep them off of yours. And do your best, but don't be disappointed if you're less than perfect. We live in a culture of perfection for those of you who are radiologists. We are told you never want to miss this, you never want to miss that. Miss this, you're going to hurt somebody. We always want to be right. And we strive to be, you know, right as much as we possibly can. In leadership, we don't have any perfect leaders. And you just have to get over that and understand that you just want to make things better and you want to keep getting better yourself. With that, I'm out of time, but I want to thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lexa. We really appreciate it. We are at the 1 o'clock mark, so I'll conclude the session. Thank you all for joining, and we look forward to the next session on Thursday. We'll get back to abdominal imaging. I want to thank both speakers again and all the attendees for today's session. Thank you, Dr. Lexa, Dr. Schoppe. I hope everybody will stay well, and we'll see you in the next session.